Good afternoon. I'm Leonard Chamberlin with Archer, here with another episode of DirectConnect. Today we're going to talk about the topic, what skills are necessary to be an effective compliance leader? Joined by Mark Brahmstadt, Nick Weber. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon, Leonard. How are you?
I'm well, other than some
Excellent.
technical difficulties and some early summer heat to deal with. Doing great, thank you.
Excellent. So what skills for an effective compliance manager, huh? Seems like a big topic, actually.
Number one, let's define what's a compliance leader. Are we talking about someone who manages a compliance team? We're talking about subject matter expert. Are we talking about day-to-day activities versus being in the middle of an audit? I think there's a lot of scenarios to look at there. Maybe different skill sets for different situations.
Yeah, and probably also looking at the size and complexity of the organizations as well. I know when I work with some of our clients that are, on the smaller side of the GOPs, the type of person that is involved there is different than maybe some of the larger investor-owned, very, very diverse organizations out there. You have a different skill set. You have a different level of experience as well for a variety of reasons. So, I think that's another area we could probably cover as well.
Yeah, I think kind of that list there is kind of a yes and. I think for compliance leaders, it's not necessarily position based. It's what do you do more than anything. But I think there are some cross cutting pieces you've got to have for all of those. The first one that comes to mind is patience, and lots of it. And then the second is attention to detail. Doesn't matter if you're entry level, your first SME, where you're the third deep backing up somebody else, or you're the SIP senior manager, or anybody in between. You got to take the time to understand all of the things, and again, a ton of patience, even to read through the standards. But then that attention to detail, that's where I know, Leonard, you've probably seen it as well on actual audits and mock audits and prep. It's always the little things that end up tripping somebody up, that turn into the big things.
I concur, and that's actually the first thing that came to mind when I started thinking about this topic was being detail oriented. There's such a tendency maybe to fall back on your expertise and generalize responses, which again I think is an important skill to have. But when you're thinking about being an effective compliance leader, knowing how to obviously keep your expertise, your experiences in mind, but also looking at specifically what question is being asked either by an auditor or what is the requirement, and looking at those details, looking at the definition. Sometimes you may be dealing with a regulator approved definition that might be different from what your previous experience has been. So details are certainly an important thing. I was also thinking another aspect of this is understanding how the standards are written, less about what are the specific requirements, but looking at how the standards themselves may require a different perspective. It's one thing to, for instance, only permit certain ports and services, but doing the manner that's compliant with the standards, having that proper justification documentation, having being able to demonstrate that performance evidence that goes with it. It's more than maybe just, again, what your previous experience yields, right?
That's a good point, Leonard. I also looked at it from the standpoint of when you think about some of the folks, especially this is more for the larger organizations. You've got to have an individual who can take everything that we've talked about thus far and be able to apply it and pull subject matter experts and their team members along and make sure they can do all of that as well. Because as a leader, as a subject matter expert, as someone who's been experienced in compliance for a long time, you guys know that all of the areas and things to look at and uncover. But as you bring new subject matter experts into your organization, as they come up in the organization and get promoted, allowing them to understand the need to be a detail-oriented, and what does that mean to be detail-oriented in the right way and through the right lens. I think those are some of the successful leaders that I've seen out there. Now, also, I definitely want to draw the distinction between leader and manager. There are people who manage teams, manage compliance teams, and they do a great job. That doesn't necessarily mean they're the leader in that space in their organizations. You see folks who are the subject matter experts, the people that really thrive in their role and their knowledge, and they're the informal/formal leader in their spaces as well.
And I think you just nailed it there, Mark, with kind of what you really need is to understand who your lineup is and put them in the right spots and then let them do their thing. I know one of the things I've seen a lot of, and I don't want to go too far into the rabbit hole of what you shouldn't be, but where I've seen a lot of mistakes or errors is where somebody thinks they have to know every answer to be that leader. And that always gets people in trouble when you start speaking on things that you're not the leader on, or you're not the expert, the subject matter expert. And I know a lot of compliance managers who've given that advice and then forgot to heed their own advice. They were sitting in front of the auditors or other regulators. So yeah, that's a big piece is knowing your people's strengths and weaknesses and putting them in a position to succeed, and then letting them. That can be one of the hardest parts of leadership is letting people do their thing.
Yep. Oftentimes,
especially when you've helped train them.
Yeah, sorry, Nick. Oftentimes you'll see managers become leaders once they start managing a team of people that they're not an expert in that technology, that space, that discipline. So that's really at the point where they start to find their leadership capabilities when they're outside their subject matter expertise. So Leonard, I'll maybe a question for you. You've got different experiences from Nick. Some things I was wondering about from your seats, through your lens. You've got to experience both as a consultant and as a former regulator, folks that have been extremely successful. Where have you seen them not be successful? I know, Nick, you kind of teed it up a little bit with not be negative, but I think how you see people not be successful can also help folks learn as well. So where have you seen that, Leonard?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. And I think it comes back to, what y'all were saying as far as having the right people in the positions. That goes at the leader level too. So it's not just the people that work for you, but it's being involved yourself. So from the federal perspective, former regulator, SIP requires a position called a SIP senior manager that overall authority and responsibility for leading compliance for the organization. And I always found it very interesting when the SIP senior manager was too busy to show up for the audit, right? So, lack of involvement at arguably, the Super Bowl of your season from a compliance perspective. That's always very telling. SIP senior manager is just a SIP specific term, but I think that could be extrapolated to other standards that require similar positions to be identified. But lack of involvement, I think, is big. Not having the right person in the position, for instance, that has that authority, that responsibility for leading compliance. If you're going to be an effective compliance leader, then you have to, be able to wield, both the tools of the trade, both the carrot and the stick, right? To encourage that adoption of compliance, because it doesn't just happen organically. It has to have some leader, for companies to adopt it.
Very good. Now, Nick, one question I had kind of saved for you for this conversation as well was around your experience as you served. Talk about detail oriented. When I think of being detail oriented, I think of the U.S. military being very detail oriented, and obviously you were in very technical roles there as well. So how do you think that your experience outside of a compliance world helped prepare you as well for those that are thinking of getting into it?
Honestly, the biggest thing I think I would take from that is that I'm not naturally a detail-oriented person, so I try to find the people who are and rely on them very heavily.
Yeah.
I'm more of a big picture, hey, let's go this way, or big strategic. But then understanding who my detail people are and letting them know, like, call me out, like, hold me accountable if I get too glossy on things, and understanding that there is a need for both of those. We talked about detail-oriented, but actually just sitting through some interactions earlier this morning, how do you take the detail that would be a 300-page book and put it down into a one-page response? How do you distill that down to something that the person who is not in that system all day, every day can understand, and that also won't take them 3 weeks to read? So kind of a diverse skill set, but
Absolutely. And now, all three of us are seeing this play out as we're starting to work with more and more clients in the oil and gas space, TSA recommendations. I don't think we can say regulations yet, but the requirements from the TSA to the oil and gas space, we're starting to see folks that that are in very technical roles that are by nature also very detail oriented. And have run great security organizations. Some of them for the first time are really getting thrown into compliance level conversations. So we're starting to see some of this play out real time on what does it take to be a great compliance leader, because folks that weren't previously are now having to become compliance leaders. So I've got some comments there, but or Nick, any comments there from what you're seeing?
that's something to be really challenging. I know last winter I was asked to write a procedure for something that I do regularly. And for me to step back and take something that's just kind of a second nature, large task to me now and break it down to a new, marginally informed, brand new person procedure, that took me probably close to a month to be able to unpack all those different functions and break it back down to that basic level to teach it.
Yeah.
And then to write it all down. That was the other part that to me was just like, man, how do I do, almost like teaching one of my kids to tie their shoe. You just do it. Like, just tie your shoe. But then to break it down into each step of that instead of that complex function, that can be a real challenge.
We all know you got Velcro. You're okay.
Lock laces.
There you go. It's interesting in some of the conversations that I've been on early with the TSA conversations, asking folks where, asking them about their programs, their security programs, their protocols, obviously extremely knowledgeable. They've got things well in hand, but some of the very early questions I heard were, can you prove it? Can you show me how you can demonstrate it? And that's where the wheels come off the bus real quick. So again, that different lens that a compliance leader has to look through than just someone who's managing security for an organization is some of the things that I've seen.
Back, Mark, to one of the points I was trying to make earlier, that understanding the standards themselves and what they specifically require is only part of the bigger picture, right? It's understanding how you need to demonstrate compliance. It's not just hey, I did this, but proving it. To your point,
one of the questions that I always like to use, whether I was an auditor or an SME or a manager, or the brief time I was a compliance manager, was, that's great that you know how to do this. Can the new guy do it? And that is a real good way to test how well that training and those procedures have been written. But being able to think outside the box of how do you get around some of those, particularly some of the more prickly SMEs, and get them on board with things they really don't want to do. But one of the other pieces to me that really strikes out in compliance that gets overlooked a lot, leadership, is the ability to drive continuous improvement and ongoing learning. How do you take that lessons learned? How do you come out of an exercise or an audit and not only document how things went, but start to internalize those and use that to level up? And as doesn't matter which compliance framework it is, they're all maturing, and as they mature, the audits get harder. I think there's a number of us that can look at, oh, we did great last audit. You don't really necessarily take a step back and say, what can you do better? Next one comes around and it's a bloodbath. So you've got to be able to drive that even when it doesn't seem like it's obvious, or the need for it's obvious.
Yeah, I've seen those conversations play out specifically in organizations where they rely heavily, whether they know it or not, they rely heavily on that tribal knowledge. They've got really good people. They've got really good, smart people that have been there a long time, and all of us would trust them to do it and know it and handle it, whatever that is. But to that point, if they win the proverbial lottery and don't come in the next day, new person steps in, train this new person. That's where some organizations struggle more than others. Comparatively, you have some organizations, and it's kind of fun to see it happen in front of you when they do that, and they get asked the question and they immediately go, oh yeah, that's John's space, let me pull in John, or that Betty's expertise there, and I know she wrote the procedure there, let me pull her in. And that's when you start to see real quickly the organizations that from a leader perspective have started to unlock it a little bit more.
I'd say one of the other ones is situational awareness. And I'd say that with a very specific SIP standard in mind. A lot of people, whether it was COVID, the holidays, or a number of reasons, SIP 8 version 6 came into effect right after the first of the year in 21, I think. So it kind of flew under the radar, and I think a lot of people missed. There's a lot of little hooks in that. And only the people who are really paying attention or really plugged in saw that, ooh, this touches a bunch of other things too. Let's start looking at this. So yeah, it's not always going to be the big SIP version 5 transition from V3 to V5 or the new TSA guidance. Is that what I'm not sure what we're calling TSA these days. It's not always something big and flashy. It can be something that seems fairly small and a small innocuous verbiage change that has massive implications. You've really got to be able to understand the landscape out there and how that can change with happy to glad in a standard language can have a major implication.
We've kind of maybe are up against time here a little bit. Maybe just do one last piece of recommendation from each of you, and I'll go last, as to where you think folks, and because it could be electric utility, oil and gas, could be any framework that you're managing against. What makes a good compliance leader? What makes an effective compliance leader? Leonard, you first, then Nick, and then I'll go.
Sure. So, we talked about a number of concepts, but I still go back to my opening comment, which was about the detail-oriented nature. Of course, everything we talked about is important to be an effective compliance leader, but if I had to boil it down to what I think is the most important skill, it's having the ability to focus on the details. So there's a lot of noise that'll happen, not only from your auditor, but also from other silos. Every organization has them, and standards typically are cross-silo, right? So being able to focus not only on what necessarily you're hearing from other silos, but specifically what's required, and drive that to the finish line, I think is priority one.
Since Leonard grabbed the low-hanging fruit, I'm gonna quote Hamilton and never be satisfied. That's probably the biggest one. It's good enough is not really something that works in compliance. It was good enough for the last audit, but it's not good enough for next time. So again, embrace that continuous improvement and drive for change.
And I'll go off on a slightly different direction and say a little bit of a play off continuous improvement, but continuous education, finding ways to continue to learn yourself. And for those folks that have a team that they're finding educational opportunities for their team, and especially for the formal leaders of the programs, making sure that they've got a good peer network with other compliance leaders that are similar in shape, size, look, feel to them. What are they doing differently? And it's, at the end of the day, while each organization, whether it's electric utility, oil and gas, or otherwise, they are unique. you're not going through it alone either. Somebody's done it somewhere before you have, or at least looked at it differently than you have. So don't feel like you got to be doing it alone, and use the resources out there. And there's lots of groups out there, whether it's, if you're Public Power, APPA, Energy Sec, NRECA, lots of groups out there. But you can make that group real small and real focused on your needs as well. So I think that's it for me.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your time, gentlemen. Great conversation, and looking forward to the next one.
Look forward to the next one as well. Thank you, guys.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
Stay up to date on all the videos we release here at Archer by clicking on the subscribe button. Click on the bell to be notified right away when we release new videos. If you know of a topic or someone you think we should talk to on DirectConnect, please let us know in the comments below.